shot. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to the presentation here, and after the beautiful compass, which really is the bulk of the thing I want to talk about. I don't know how familiar all of you are with St. Herman of Alaska. I'm sure some of you, a lot of us will be new, some of us will be old. I do want to say if I skipped your favorite St. Herman of Alaska story, I apologize in advance. There's so many. There's so very many of them. If you look at the OCA website, for instance, on any of the saints, you'll have some saints that have a little paragraph. You'll have some saints that have quite a bit of material. If you look at St. Herman, there's a ton of stuff on the OCA website for St. Herman. And no wonder. We sang tonight. I think it was pretty much one of the last Takians that talked about. First saint of America. Thank goodness. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's perfect. Page 10. I remember that much. Oh, I was looking at the wrong spot. Thank you. I don't want the Kentucky or the Eagles. I want the actual verses. That's why I'm so confused. Okay, so God help me here. Rejoice, protector of all who honor you. Rejoice, founder of America, of Orthodoxy in our land. Rejoice, confirmation of those who come to the Orthodox faith. Rejoice, most glorious protector of the Church in America. Rejoice, her saint and her wondrous Father. Rejoice, our venerable Father Herman of Alaska. So high praise indeed. So the life and legacy of St. Herman of Alaska, America's first saint, was he really the first bringer of Orthodoxy to America? Well, we give him that honor, we give him that title, but Orthodoxy was here in bits and pieces. He really solidified it in America, as I hope you will see tonight. The prayer that you see here, the Blessed Hermit of Spruce Island, good teacher of the faith of the Holy Trinity, fitting for the church, and our spiritual Father, intercede before the throne of Almighty God for peace within the church, the distilling of all disunity, faithlessness, and discord. That is from the prayer that the Father read at the end when we were on his knees. There's a big long prayer that we have for St. Herman, and that's a piece of it. I can give you one or two more pieces of it as we go through this, but that's what we're talking about here. We call upon him to dispel disunity, first of all. You know, the church in America needs his intercession for unity, and so we called him for that, among other things. So, another portion of the prayer: O Holy Father and patron of the Church in America, be a physician to the weak in faith, be a support to the fallen, be a defender to the defenseless, a bulwark of strength to the weary in spirit, and be a guide to the travelers by sea, by land, and by air. Be our heavenly intercessor. And he was all of these things, except maybe by air, when he walked the earth, right? So he was a support, as we will see, to the people in many ways, defending the defenseless especially, and a bulwark of strength to those weary in spirit. And so we see that in his life. What about St. Herman? So St. Herman, he was basically born. We're not exactly sure. There's some conjectures, and the best conjecture we have is he was born in like 1857 at some point. There's some confusion, but there's some difference of opinion about his early life. But what we do know is that he ended up at the monastery of St. Sergius, which is up near St. Petersburg, what we used to call in the Cold War, Leningrad, I guess. I don't know what they call it nowadays, just Petersburg. It's St. Petersburg once again. So he ended up at the monastery of St. Sergius as a very young man. And even at the age of 12, it is said that he was He was there. He was cellmates. Basically, he was taken under the wing of an elder Herman and taught the ways of monasticism. He was a man, as we will see, who had a great love for solitude, for prayer, for ascetic living, for feats of ascetic strength, and so forth. He was not a large man. He was a fairly small-framed individual, but yet as we will see, he turned out to be very, very strong because he was such a hard worker, and he struggled very mightily in some of his tasks. But at the monastery of St. Sergius, he was there, I think, for about 5 to 6 years, from the age of 12 and onward, where he spent a lot of time with this elder for long. One of the first miracles, this is a blurry picture taken from one of my Life of St. Herman icons. I'll show you some pictures of that coming up here. But one of the earliest things that we know about his life was the miraculous healing when he was about 16. Roughly when he was 16 years old. He, again, at the monastery of St. Sergius, he was devoting his life, as we sang, to the Lord at an early point in his life. And yet, even early in his life, it looked like his life was about to be cut short. He had a tremendous growth, a lump, an abscess on his throat, on his face. It was very large, very nasty. I've heard it described in some of the readings I did as a cancer, and it was not a pretty thing. It smelled bad, and it looked like he was going to die. It really did. And so he wept in tears before the icon of the Theotokos all night in prayer at one point. And at the end of his prayers, he was so wiped out finally by morning that he simply took his cloth and he wiped it across in faith, the icon of the Theotokos, placed it on his neck, and then finally went to sleep after a night of prayer and crying and just seeking the Lord with this. And then when he awoke, the swelling was gone. It was a miracle. It was an absolute miracle. The doctors could not understand this. Everybody had feared that he was going to be gone. The swelling had gone down. The abscess didn't, or the growth didn't pop, I guess would be the word I would use. And it just left a little tiny mark for the rest of his life. But he was healed, completely healed. And I think this is one of the things that really is the keystone events in his life that gave him the faith to do what he did. He was a man of great faith and a great devotion to the Theotokos. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So he was at St. Sergius Monastery, not really too far from Valam Monastery. Where's my globe tonight? Not that you can see it real well pointing this out. If you know where Valam Monastery is, it's right. So Lake Lagoda, some islands out there where the monastery spread out. At the time of St. Herman, this is the late 1800s. This would have been 1793 when he came to Valam at the age of 42. The monastery it wasn't what it looks like today. At the time, it was actually rather in disrepair. The buildings were kind of wooden. There had not been a lot of people there in the past. In fact, at this time, it was just getting kind of reconstituted under the direction of Archbishop Gabriel and Hiram Nazarius. Hiram Nazarius was given the title Streutel, if I'm saying that correctly, or builder. In 1781, he was kind of commissioned to rebuild the monastery. And this is part of the great flowering of monastic life in Russia at that time. The Valam Monastery was coming back up. They were putting in new buildings of stone and giving it its kind of form of glory, and more like what it is today. And we see that in 1781, when this work began, there was only 4 people living there, 4 monks. 4. Right? This is one of the greatest monasteries that the world had. At that time, it had fallen into such disrepair and disuse that there was just a handful of monks there. And so when St. Herman arrived in the late 1700s, he was part of a lot of the monks that were rebuilding the monastery. So he actually, I think, if I recall, he was in charge of some operations at a quarry, a stone quarry, to get the stone for the rebuilding project there. And he was, his strength was evident in that work because he's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And and the rebuilding of this monastery. At Valon, after a few years, he actually became sort of a semi-Hermetic monk. If you know what that means, it's semi-Hermetic, like a semi-hermit. So he was a great lover of solitude that was inculcated in when Saint Sergius under the direction of Arlong. When he was at Valon, he also wanted that solitude. So he went out. He was given the permission to go out into the woods, maybe a mile from the main monastery complex at that time, which was a lot more wild at that time. Of course, wasn't a mile was a good distance. He found what was called Herman's Field, and it's still to this day called Herman's Field. You have a picture there of a chapel there at the location of Herman's Field at Valon. He had the permission of the Abbot Nazarius, and he lived in this field. He also, at the age of 42, in this kind of semi-hermetic life period that he had, he also had a cellmate. Just like he had a cellmate back at St. Sergius, he had a cellmate at this time, a novice by the name of Kuzman Alexeyevich Telepnev. He was only 20 years old while St. Herman was 42. They kind of lived in this state, I guess you'd call it, this little semi-hermetic. So what happened would be on a feast day, on a major festival, then he would go to church and he would engage with the hymns and the psalms so much, so on, and just bear with me. I'm telling Father that I teach for a living for 25 years and I don't use PowerPoint. So I'm like looking at these notes and thinking, are they from a page back or a page forward? So another page. Anyways, St. Herman's Field, Valon. All right, so what's going on in the world at this time? We have the Russian-American company. Russia had basically discovered Alaska in the 1850s, let's say 40s and 50s. And over time, they began, there was a lot of expansion going on, just as there was in America, westward expansion. In Russia, there was a lot of eastward expansion. There was a lot of fur traders. There was a lot of people looking for resources in fur trading and trying to make their fortune in this world and expand the empire, really. And in the 1850s, after the discovery of the Alaskan area, the Russian-American company was formed. There was basically these two companies that were given government grants, essentially, to go out and tame this wilderness and bring resources and expand the empire. And one of them was the Russian-American company under the directorship of a man named Shelikov. Shelikov had, in 1583, I think it was, he had expanded into what is now known as Kodiak Island. There's a map coming up here in the next page. But on Kodiak Island, he basically went in and conquered the natives there, went in there and slaughtered them, essentially, right? And was able to set up shop there and begin his exploitation of the land. Now, additionally, with that attitude toward the natives that were there was also the fact that whenever the Russians had come into this new land, it's just like when the Europeans had come to North America, as oftentimes happened with a first contact like that, when they also brought disease with them. And so also in this case, when the first contact was made, new diseases that people weren't used to, the natives were not used to, were now kind of rampant. And so in many places, including like the Kodiak Island there, 80% of the people were dead, had died because of not being able to handle these new diseases that came from the new people coming in. And so that's kind of the situation. The Russian-American company going in to take exploit, find fur and exploit and so on. And so the ironic thing is that after setting up shop in Kodiak and Sitka. Actually, let me go back a little bit here and show you a little bit of the expanse of what's happening. So Shelikoff had a big battle there with the natives. The company had spread down to Sitka. That's kind of where the headquarters were for a lot of these endeavors to go and kind of plunder and make their fortunes. So there's outposts and trading posts all along this chain, the Aleutian chain, Kodiak, a little bit in the mainland, and down along here in the Pacific Northwest, and even further south, right? So that's the lay of the land that we're talking about. The Russians would come in they came in with these fur traders. The fur traders, a lot of them had families and stuff in the old country, but they knew that a lot of them were running away from that as well. So they basically took up with some of the native women and so forth. There was a lot of contact and interchange between the fur traders, the people that were already there, and there was some preparation through all that for the coming of Christianity. So they were bringing the faith, but they had no priests with them. They had no clergy with them. So that entire area had some sense that there was a religion there, a Christian religion, but there was no clergy to kind of teach it and set up a framework for it and promulgate it. And so what happened was that the Russian-American company actually sent back to Russia and asked that priests or monks and priests would be sent to this new land to establish the church there. Now, I think maybe their motive was a little mixed here, but that's how the mission that brought St. Herman to Alaska kind of got its start. We had the original mission from Guam, and there was a request that Valam would put together a team of monks that would come over here, and some of the first volunteer was St. Herman. We have a list here of the folks that did come. We have Archimandrite Joseph was the leader of the group. We had a couple of higher monks, Juvenali, who were familiar with St. Juvenali, higher monk Macarius, higher monk Athanasius. There was a higher deacon. There was St. Herman, and then there were these four novices, including St. Herman's cellmate from back in Valam, Kuzma Televnev. Yes.
Who requested this mission?
It was actually the Russian American company, the Shelikoff company, requested this. Now, why? He had kind of a mandate from the emperor to go in and expand the empire and take these lands in the name of the empire and so forth. And ostensibly, they were Christian people. So it was kind of the right thing to do. But as we see, the motives were a little bit mixed. I think that you'll see that it was a little disingenuous at some level that they were asking for this mission to be established. But nevertheless, they went. Shelikoff, when he requested the mission, actually let them know that, hey, we have a church set up, we have supplies ready, we have all the resources you're going to need, and it turns out none of that was actually true. So in 1793, these monks did take up from Valam. Here's what I want to use the globe here. I want to show you the distance involved in this. It's rather amazing. I don't know if any of you had a globe when you were young, but one of my favorite things, I don't know if you can see this in the dark, but let me just turn the light off for a minute here. Kind of give you something pop. So here's our globe, right? We have Valam. Valam is up near St. Petersburg, right about here. And then we have Alaska over here. If we take a look at what's involved here, we have a distance. I'm going to use a very accurate measuring system. My fingers here, this is my dividers. We go from Valam to Irkutsk, which is at the bottom of Lake Baikal, if you remember your geography. You have a pretty big span across the globe. And then when you go from Irkutsk over to Alaska, you have an even bigger span of land. So let's take a look at the land, the trip from where we're going. We're going from Kodiak Island to where they sailed. Let's go from where they sailed from here. Basically, the Gulf of, here, Okhotsk, right? Actually, let's go back to Yakutsk down around here. Right, if we look at that span, we compare that to where we are. We're in Pennsylvania, and we're using that same span. It's basically, if you were to walk from Pennsylvania to Alaska, that's just the distance from where they ended up in Alaska to kind of the jumping off point in Yakutsk, right? That's like half their trip. The other half was from there back to Volom. So imagine walking from Pennsylvania to Alaska and back. That's the kind of distances roughly that we're talking about here with this endeavor. Yes.
Do we know how long the journey took them?
It was from the beginning of the year to about September.
So they
with some breaks involved.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
They traveled as you can see, they traveled through the wilds of Siberia on dogs, mainly on dogs, right? In the wintertime, by the way. Vast trip. At one point, when they were actually on horseback, then from the first leg of the journey from Irkutsk up to Yakutsk, they were attacked by grizzly bears. Not Pennsylvania black bears, which are fairly tame, but like grizzly bears, right? Somehow they managed to fight off the grizzly bears. Then that's not dangerous enough. The freezing winter in Siberia, the grizzly bears, the horseback riding. The most difficult part of that trip is actually the sea journey. That part of the ocean is very, very dangerous. Pretty much 1 out of 3 trips in those days did not make it, and they were just lost forever. Nobody knew what happened to them. And that plays a part of our story here a little bit. But very, very crazy, dangerous, long journey. On foot, mainly. It was monks. It was a number of settlers. It was a number of kind of the fur trader guys. If you think about what's going on in the world at this time in America, on colonies and stuff, we had a lot of people pushing west. Then we had what was called the long hunters. They would go out into the wilderness for long months at a time and just kind of journey out there. These are kind of the folks that the company was sending out to do the actual work of prospecting for furs and resources and so forth. So this journey was amazing. It was amazingly long. It was very difficult. It's got a little bit of a tie here to our church here. Probably some of you recognize this priest here. If you don't, he's hanging on the wall over here as well. Father John Reeves, that was Father Ignatius' predecessor here. And I was lucky to be able to find this back in 2010, back when I was just a catechumen coming into the church. Father John was he had a whole blog on his following in the footsteps of St. Herman. And this is all I can find of it is the login screen. I can't find the actual content. I think it's been taken down. But he reenacted this journey, undertook this journey, he and another priest, and with trains and modern conveniences and so forth. And it was quite the adventure, even in those cases. So if you could ever turn up the story of Father John's visit.
I remember that.
You remember reading?
I remember reading his blog.
I followed that very closely. In church at that time, I had settled on, or St. Herman had settled on me, I think, and I was really following that very, very closely. And it's just amazing, even with the modern conveniences, how called and extensive of a trip that really was. So they finally made it, despite the bear attacks and the freezing conditions and choppy seas and all that sort of thing. In 1794, they did arrive on Kodiak Island. 10 monks, all 10 monks made it. There was 45 settlers, and there were 62 of these kind of fur trader trapper guys, which were called Promleshniki. Yeah, forgive me. Russian's not even my third or fourth language, but and so what did they find when they arrived? What did they find? Remember what Shelikov had promised them. He had promised them a church. He had promised them provisions. What they found was nothing. They found violence. They found no church, no supplies. The conditions were extremely primitive. It was winter. They had no food, and yet that's what they got there. When they got there, of course, this is a painting of them arriving at Kodiak Island. This is a part of a life icon where they're arriving on Kodiak Island, and of course, giving thanks for a safe trip, and no wonder, given all the dangers that they had faced. Let me go back to our map a little bit, because before they even got to Kodiak Island, they had come along the Aleutian chain, and so kind of wound their way up here. This is where they're heading to. But by the time they got up to Unalaska, this island here, they kind of been blown off course into Unalaska. And what they found was remarkable, very remarkable, I think. Now, remember I said that these fur trapper people they'd been there for decades, kind of, exploiting resources and so forth, and they brought some awareness of Christianity with them. They had taken on wives in the islands here. And what the people there knew of Christianity was enough for them to welcome this mission, and actually they were ripe for the harvest. So when the leader, Archimandrite Joseph of this expedition, got to Unalaska with this because they'd been blown off course to Unalaska, he ended up baptizing 7,000 people. Wow. And actually married in the church another 2,500, I think it was, people. I don't know if I have the numbers written there, but they were ready to hear this message. They were ready for these people. They were ready for the monks. And so they found fruitful ground there. I hit the wrong button. So what did they find? As I said, there was none of the stuff that had been promised to them by Shelikov and the Russian-American company. Things were pretty violent and primitive. The quarters that they had were basically shared with the town. They were not very conducive to monastic life in any way whatsoever. It was loud. People were coming in and out all the time, carrying on. There was no solitude. There was no way for them to maintain a monastic, organized prayer life. They did the best that they could, but it was
like a Wild West.
It was exactly like the Wild West, except it was up way up in the Alaskan region. It's kind of like if you shift things by about 10 or 20 years, that's exactly what they found up there. It was what we think of as the American expansion westward. Like I said, they did have great success with baptisms and marriage before and after arriving on Kodiak Island finally. When they got to the island, there was no church. They had to build a church. This is the Holy Resurrection Cathedral in Kodiak, Alaska. This is not the church that they built. This is actually the fourth one since then. This one was actually built in, I think, the 1940s. It had burned down. The one before that had burned down in the 40s, and then this one was built. So the church that we have, the Holy Cathedral there in Kodiak, Alaska today, is actually the fourth of the chapel. But that parish has been there ever since 1794. Okay, so the Promishleniki. I was able to say that while I was preparing this, but now I'm standing up here in front of you, I can't say it very well. But these were the kind of the long hunters, but there's a slight difference between these guys and what we think of as kind of the Wild West expansion, is that they were kind of organized into guilds. They weren't as independent as our mountain men were, right? They kind of stuck together. They had certain skills, but they weren't real good at certain tasks, hunting certain animals and so forth. So what they ended up doing, quite frankly, was forcing the native people into servitude, forcing the remaining ones who hadn't been killed off by the diseases, forcing them into servitude to do all their work for them. And that's what they found when they got there. It was like, this isn't what we thought. Yes, the natives are especially happy to see Christianity coming, but what we're seeing with our eyes is not really what matched the description that Chelikov had sent us in terms of Christianity. So they had their work cut out for them. Yeah, okay. I know you're good. All right, so Baranov. This is a statue of the leader of the Russian-American company in America at that time, a man named Baranov. It's kind of hard to see. But this is a statue that was in Sitka, Alaska, along, as I showed you earlier, down along kind of near, further down the coast, along closer to the United States now. This was a statue that actually is no longer there. It was removed in 2020, I believe. He was kind of canceled, and for good reason. This was the leader of the Russian-American company. He was a product of his era. What does that mean? That means that at that time, he was given a great responsibility by the emperor through this Chelikov, who has basically a monopoly on fur trading and so forth, and developing these resources. And so the idea, the mindset back then amongst people like him was, you are a servant to the empire. The empire is not out to make sure everybody is healthy and wealthy and taken care of. We are here to provide for the empire so that they're taken care of and expanded, right? So he was a hard man. He was a very hard man. And he wanted these monks that were sent. He wanted them for the reasons. Chelikov had written them a kind of a secret letter saying, "Hey, I'm sending these monks." The monks had a letter saying, "Hey, you're going to be here to do this, this, and this, to promote Christianity and build a church and all this sort of thing." Baranov's letter said, "Hey, I want you to use these guys, Father Juvenali, especially the Saint Juvenali and Father Stephen, because they had industrial skills. They had knowledge of how to salt metals and mine and do real practical things, and they were trying to really industrialize this area and make the most of it. So they wanted their knowledge. They wanted the monks kind of keeping out of their hair, not stirring up trouble between the kind of shaking things up the way they were. So Chelikov had instructed Baranov actually to keep the monks away from the lady and the lady away from the monks as much as you possibly can, and try and use them to further the mission of the company. He did send instructions, though, to use one of the monks, Father Macarius, as a school teacher, but that school teacher was mainly for the children of the fur traders, the word I can't pronounce too well, so that they would be educated and carry on the work of the company. All right, so as I said, and as they came to Kodiak Island, they met with some success in preaching and baptizing and spreading the faith. And this really excited, especially Saint Juvenali and Saint Macarius, or Father Macarius. Father Macarius went north to the mainland. Let me again go back to my map here. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Father Macarius, there was a rumor, there was a kind of legend that, like I said, the seas were very dangerous. There was a legend of a lost ship back in the 40s and 50s, I think it was, that disappeared. Yet there was a legend persisting that there was a colony somewhere up here of Russian traders that were thriving and doing well. And so Father Macarius, he kind of set out in that direction, looking for them. By the way, these people were never found, and it remained a legend. But he went up there, and he also had success in converting people and bringing Christianity to them. I just lied to you. He went along the Aleutian chain. He went along the Aleutian chain and found great success. Saint Juvenali went north looking for this, and he ran into some trouble. So he ran into some success and some trouble. Saint Juvenali went up north. He preached the gospel. People responded well to it. And then he began to preach about, from the accounts I've read, he began to teach them that, well, you can't have all these wives that you have. You have to have just one wife and things of that nature. And that kind of stirred up some problems. And so he was eventually martyred. If you know the story of St. Juvenale's martyrdom, as he was leaving this area near Iliamnia, they kind of decided, no, we're gonna turn on him, basically, and they martyred him. But before this all happened, when the monks in Kodiak were together before his martyrdom, Saint Juvenale and Father Macarius, they would actually argue. I wouldn't say fight, but they would argue about who's going to take what land to preach the gospel, and they were kind of jealous of their territory. Not jealous, but they were kind of zealous for their territories. That they wanted to kind of, I want this part, and I want this part, and so Saint Herman actually was very cheered by hearing this argument, divvying up the territory. He was very, very pleased to hear the zealousness for spreading the gospel, and it really cheered him on. Saint Herman would write to his spiritual father back in Valam throughout his life, Father Nazarios, right, or Archimandrite, and even after his death, his successor, Saint Herman, would continue to write to his successor as well. We have a lot of Saint Herman's earlier letters to him still, or some of them at least. But he was very, very inspired by the fact that these monks were so zealous to kind of fight over who's going to get the chance to preach to these people. So that's St. Juvenale, St. Macarius. Father Macarius, as I said mistakenly, he was sent to the Aleutian Islands, and he had great success there. But in 1796, he was going to take word back to Russia, back to St. Petersburg, about what the actual conditions were here. That things weren't quite what had been promised, things weren't what they seemed. There's a lot of mistreatment going on of the natives, and so forth, a lot of brutality. And so he returns. He returns to Russia. Also, Archimandrite Joseph, the leader of this expedition, also went back to Russia. And when he was in Russia, he was actually consecrated bishop of Kodiak. So now they were going to have a bishop. Really good news. So Father Macarius gets all the way to St. Petersburg, lets them know what's going on in 1796, comes back, rejoins Archimandrite Joseph, who's now the new bishop, and they climb aboard the ship, the Phoenix. This is how they spell it in, I guess, transliterated Russian. I saw that word, I scratched my head and I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. That sounds like a word. It sounds like the English word phoenix, P-H-O-E-N-I-X, the phoenix, the bird that crashes in a fiery flame and is rebirthed from the ashes. Well, the ship, the Phoenix, in 1799, it's bringing back Bishop Joseph, it's bringing back Father Macarius, it's bringing back a number of other priests and monks as well, and it goes down. It goes down the ocean. They were along the Aleutian chain somewhere near Unalaska, and it went in, and everybody was killed, unfortunately. So they never did get their bishop. This was the beginning of a very, very dark period for the remaining monks now on Kodiak Island. They lost their leaders. Father St. Juvenale had been martyred. Father Macarius was dead. The bishop was dead. It was just Father Herman and a couple other guys, and some of them were beginning to have some real concerns and thoughts about this. The Phoenix, by the way, was one of the first seagoing ships that was actually built in the New World, in Alaska. And it just says here that it was caught in storms and everybody perished. All right, fair enough. Part 2. So as I said, this was the beginning of a very dark period. We had no leadership. The conditions were awful. the word that they had sent back to Russia, it looks like that nothing was going to happen because they had, nothing was coming back from Russia in response to this. They didn't know what had happened to Father Makarios. Baranov. I have a picture of Baranov here, and I don't know how many of you have seen Apocalypse Now. This is kind of a weird tie-in, but anybody familiar with that movie? A certain age, right? So it's based upon, I don't know if I could recommend that in an Orthodox setting, but it's a very cinematically wonderful movie. But it is based on a book, The Heart of Darkness. And it's essentially the story of what happens when people get so far away from authority and oversight, and they have powers that nobody can stop them from doing what they want, and they descend into madness. And so I don't know if it's exactly fair to compare Baranov to Colonel Kurtz, but in some ways there's some really good parallels here. The Russian-American company was kind of operating without any kind of oversight. At this period of time from 1799 to like 1803 or 1804, there weren't any ships even getting through. They were all floundering and shipwrecking. So there was a real problem with communication, and Baranov was kind of the local authority, and he basically just did what he wanted. And that included continuing to mistreat and bless the natives and force them into labor. When I talk about that being mistreated, life is very hard in Alaska. Food is very difficult to come by. There's only a limited amount of time in a year where you can gather food and essentials and stock up on them. And so what happened was Baranov and his fur traders would take the men of the villages and force them to work during this period so that they weren't even able to provide and store food away for their families. And this was slowly and surely reducing the population. It was not good. It was very, very oppressive for these people. Well, St. Herman wasn't real pleased with that. St. Herman was a wonderful, wonderful saint, but one of the descriptions of it, from a friendly source, by the way, this Wrangel, so we'll hear of him later, described him as having a fiery temperament when it came to seeing this mistreatment of the natives. So having a fiery temperament, he was not indifferent to the offenses and oppressions which the other members of the missions frequently experienced from the local authorities. And with fervor, he stood up for the natives' rights. He was the only person speaking up for the natives. And these rights were being violated by obstinacy, cruelty, debauchery of the Promlichniki and the management, the fur traders. And because of this, he himself was subject to a multitude of discomforts. Father Herman also was mistreated as well. They did not have a lot of respect for him. In fact, Baranov called him, was time to take comfort, as my patron saint is characterized by Baranov as the most caustic of hermits, an hack writer, and a chatterer. Right? So I take a little bit of comfort from the fact that my patron was accused of these things. But he would stick up. He got his ire up a little bit. No, I'm not saying he wasn't saintly about it. His sense of justice was certainly rightly riled up by this mistreatment. There's a description here. So because of his fighting back, Baranov basically had him under house arrest. All the monks under house arrest, if you will. They were not to leave the building that they were in for almost a year. There was no services. There was no anything Christian going on due to Baranov's disgust with these people, these monks. They were basically locked away. But he was a meek man. He's described here as having a fiery temperament, but he, in general, was a very meek and mild and wonderful man. Again, from a friendly source, and I'm going to read this to you. All the features of the elder's face reflecting goodness, his pleasant smile, his meek and attractive mien, his humble and quiet behavior, and his gracious word. He was short of stature. His face was pale and covered with wrinkles. His eyes were grayish blue, full of sparkle, and on his head there were a few gray hairs. His voice was not powerful, but it was pleasant. And also the description talks about how Father Herman, and this is why I picked this particular picture here, Father Herman especially loved children. He made a large quantity of biscuits for them, and he baked cookies for them, and the children were very fond of the elder. Father Herman's love for the Aleuts reached the point of self-denial. So he was very, had a lot of empathy. When he saw these people that he was treated, he had real love for them, and did everything he could to the point of self-denial. Well, this went on, these dark times went on for 5 years, about 5 years, until 1804. There was a Father Gideon who finally was sent from Russia after the report that Father Macarius had taken back. Father Gideon was sent to Alaska along with a government agent. These two, one was sent by the church, one was sent by the government. In 1803, the government official was named Nicholas Petrovich Razanov, who was actually the son-in-law of Shelikov, the owner of the Russian-American company. So you had the church want to find out what's going on. You had Shelikov sending his men to kind of keep things in order the way he wanted them. And they both came over on this trip that was basically an expedition, the first Russian expedition to travel around the world. We're traveling on that expedition to bring here. And so this Father Gideon and this Rezanov were on this ship. Father Gideon was treated very, very poorly on this trip. He had to put up a lot of blasphemy. He was told not to interfere with secular matters. He did not have a good time on his way over. But he arrived in June of 1804, and he did see that the conditions were as were reported. They were terrible for the people that were there, and that they were, the people were being mistreated by the Russian-American corporate company. And he tried to set things right as much as he could. He at least wanted to inspect and see what was happening. So he met with Father Herman and encouraged him to this point where he really needed a lot of encouragement. And he told him a few things. There's a letter that we have from Father Gideon that he left with St. Herman. And essentially, it boils down to him. He was put in charge of the church order, the church activities in Alaska by Father Gideon as the official head of the church at this point in Kodiak. And he was told to be an example, maintain the church property, the physical plant, be a good steward like he had been. He noticed that he had been a good steward. He encouraged him to continue to be a good steward. Continue with your enthusiastic efforts and your good-natured relationships with the natives, with the Americans. He put him in charge of the schooling. And things did, after this point, get a little bit better. Father Herman continued his work. Things kind of eased up from Baranov and the company side. In fact, Father Herman's demeanor and faith actually was able to establish pretty decent relationships between the two of them, between him and Baranov at this point. And so this went on. This happened in 1807 that he was put in charge of the church. The relationships with Baranov got better. But eventually, St. Herman, sometime, I'm not sure when, between 1808 and 1818, I tend to think it's later in that sequence, he still craved that solitude, that monastic environment that he had at Valam and St. Sergius before that. And so he decided to move to Spruce Island. Now, Spruce Island is just a little bitty island. I'll show you a map on the next slide, but it's not far from Kodiak, but it's far enough that he could have that privacy and that solitude that he was looking for. And so here's two depictions of one of these life icons of Father Herman arriving on Spruce Island and beginning to construct his little cabin, his cell. And some of the people, the Aleuts that loved him so much, you're going to be really lonely over there. Do you think you're going to be okay? There's nobody there to talk to. And Father Herman had this, and you probably, maybe some of you heard this quote. They said to him, "How do you manage to live alone in the forest, Father Herman? Don't you ever become lonesome?" He answered, "No, I am not there alone. God is here, as God is everywhere. The holy angels are there. With whom is it better to talk, with people or with angels? Most certainly with angels. So he finally began to get some of the solitude and the hermetic living that he wanted, but he wasn't cut off completely from society. He still had visitors, he still had some disciples that we'll see. There was still interaction between him and the people. Here's a little map. The Kodiak Island, and it is here. You can see the Aleutian chain. That's the Kodiak Island, and then there's a little piece right there labeled Uzini, and that's a little settlement on there. But that is Spruce Island. This is a blow up of Google Maps, and it's just kind of this portion right here to kind of show you that Spruce Island is really not far from the town of Kodiak, maybe a mile. I think it's like 1.4 miles or something, but it's not, maybe not even that. But that's the island there. It's very rugged, very forested, and that's where he found his home. The island is separated by a strait of about a mile and a quarter, and that's where he eventually went to. Okay, so the life of Saint Herman after moving to Spruce Island, we have. You've probably seen in a depiction of St. Herman icons such as these. I have both of these. They're blurry cell phone pictures, but sometimes you see icons where you have the saint, and then you have vignettes of their life, little mini icons of the scenes from their life that surround them. And so we have this that tells about his life. What was his life like on Spruce Island? There's a little quote here. It tells us something. Well, I don't want to read all this, but what was life like on Spruce Island? So, again, I said earlier that food is very difficult to raise in Alaska. That he was able to scratch out a small garden, mainly root vegetables and cabbages and tubers and things of that nature. Preserved mushrooms. Mushrooms were pretty abundant in the woods. He would get seaweed from the ocean and put it in a giant basket. This basket was so big that nobody could lift it. And somehow this small, seemingly frail Herman, he could lift this basket and carry it with no problem. There were accounts of him also being able to carry logs that nobody could lift as well. So he was a very hardy man, but he scratched out a really hard life on Spruce Island. But that's what he loved. He had worked very hard in Valon. He had worked very hard at St. Sergius. His life was all about work and prayer. And so this really suited him to live this way. His cell that he built was very sparse. His bed was just a wooden board, literally a bricks for a pillow, a board that he put on himself for a blanket. He called it his blanket. It was literally a straight board. That's the life that he lived. I lost my pointer. Anyway. One of the little vignettes that you see on the life icons is this epidemic. In 1819, there was a flu epidemic, and it kind of went through Kodiak Island and killed a lot of people. It was basically brought by another ship that had come through. They brought this flu, and a lot of the people, an awful lot of the people, the natives died. You would get the flu, and after 3 days, you would be dead. And in the height of this, there was not enough people to bury bodies. Bodies were stacking up. Literally, it was a very horrendous scene. There were small children crawling around over their parents were gone. And only St. Herman was compassionate, loving, thoughtful of his own life. He was the only one that would come in and care for those who were dying or had died, and took care of them. They never forgot us. They really were very, very blessed by his self-sacrificial attitude with us. And that's how they knew he was a saintly man.
He's probably in his late 60s at this point.
This would have been, 20, definitely in his 60s. The baby orphaned and left there to fend for itself was this Gerasim Ivanovich Zurianov. And he basically, Herman adopted him as his own, raised him, took him in, and raised him as his child, basically, his disciple. There's the story of the flood. Some of you are familiar with this. There was a flood on Spruce Island. There was a major storm going on, and a couple of people that were out there living with him were very concerned that they were all going to die. And Father Herman says, "Do not fear. The water will go no further than the spot where this icon is standing." He took an icon of the Theotokos. Now remember, his great devotion and trust in the Theotokos from the days since he was a small boy. He was 12. Here he is 40, 50 years later with a deeper faith, knowing that he will be protected by the Mother of God. He took that icon, he set it in sand, and he said, "The water will not go past this icon." And true to his prophecy, the water did not go past the spot where the icon was placed. And he told the people, he said, I promise you that the icon of the Holy Queen will protect you in the future times of similar need. Sophia was another of his disciples, a young woman of about 20 who came and begged him to serve him, basically. That she would live nearby and help him with his tasks. And he's a monk. He's like, I don't know about this. But eventually she prevailed over him, and she became a disciple as well. She was told, she was the one who was given the task of placing the icon on shallow ground in case of flooding. So I guess the story eventually comes down through this Sophia, one of his disciples. This icon, by the way, that he used is still preserved on Spruce Island. That's cool. The story of the fire. Here's another example, Ignatius, right? So, there was a fire that raged on this island. It was a very wooded island, as I said. And one day there was a fire, forest fire, and Father Herman, together with his disciple Ignatius, they basically took and they dug a ditch in the moss and turned over the moss, and kind of a fire break. It was not enough to stop a major forest fire. It was just the shovels. It was more of a line of sand that he drew, a line in the moss that said, and with his prayers, he stopped that fire from going beyond that point. He told his disciple Ignatius, "Be at peace, the fire will not cross this line." And when the fire came up to the moss, it literally just stopped right there. Another story we hear of St. Herman is when he first heard of St. Peter the Aleut. So in 1815, there was a couple of Aleutian Islanders, St. Peter being one of them, who were fishing. And they kind of drifted down along the California coast, all the way down towards L.A., actually. San Pedro, L.A., and that was the outpost of the Spanish at that time. And the boat drifted in, and they were captured by the Spanish conquistadors there, and they were basically told to renounce their faith. They said, "You need to be a Christian." Well, we are Christian. They showed them their crosses, and the Spanish said, "No, you need to become Christians like we're Christians." And they tortured them. They started cutting off people's St. Peter's knuckles one by one until he died to death. Essentially, I'm not going to get into the details of it. It was a horrible martyrdom. And so the story was related to St. Herman by this Janowski. Now, this Janowski is an interesting character, very important man, actually. Getting back to our friend Baranov, that was the leader of the Russian-American company. He eventually was, he came to his career there. He had to go back to Russia and actually face some trials for what he had done. The next guy that was in charge there was a man by the name of Hagemeister. This is a sea captain that had been converted by St. Herman. He was a Lutheran, but he started talking to St. Herman, and St. Herman converted him to Orthodoxy. And he became, after that, he became the leader of the Russian-American company there. After him, there was this Janowski. Janowski also was the replacement of this Hagemeister. He became very good friends with St. Herman. Very, very good friends. He sought him out. He heard so much about him. He sought him out and learned from him. And this Janowski is the one that relays the story of St. Peter the Aleut. St. Herman asks Janowski, "What was the name of this tortured Aleut?" And Janowski replies, "Peter," but I don't remember his last name. And St. Herman's immediate reaction was to face the icon again and say, "Holy new martyr Peter, pray to God for us." So we get that story of Saint Peter the Allelut, at least from Saint Herman. This is a famous story. This is the icon upstairs that you have upstairs in your church. The famous quote icons like this, showing Saint Herman holding that scroll with the words, "From this day forth, from this day, from this hour, from this very minute, let us love God above all." Right? The story behind this goes that I'll just read this. This is from Yanofsky as well. I would read it. Let's see. Oops. Yeah, as I said, I'm a Roman gospel. In any case, Saint Herman, there was a sloop that came by, the sloop Kamchatka, and aboard this vessel were a number of very important Russian American leaders they were going to be leaders, and he was invited aboard the ship, and they had a long talk, and Saint Herman was sitting there listening and at the talking, and they weren't sure what to make of this monk. He was kind of funnily dressed, and he didn't seem real cultured, but he's very, very impressive nonetheless. And they began to ask them, well, what are the things that you value the most? What are the things that you seek in this world the most? And some wanted a ship, some wanted their own, they wanted riches, they wanted a beautiful wife, things of that nature. And St. Herman says, well, okay, I understand you're looking for the things that you value the most, but what is more valuable than the love of God? And they agree, well, of course, the love of God, yes, that's above riches and beautiful women and my own ship and so forth. And he says, well, isn't that the most important thing we should be doing? And they agreed with him. And then St. Herman says, well, I've been trying for over 40 years to love God, and I'm not sure I've been able to do it. And they were really impressed with that. And so St. Herman then said, this is where that famous quote comes from. So let's make a deal. Let's make an agreement here that from this day forth, from this hour, from this very minute, let us love God above all. And those men on the boat, they were future important figures in history, in Russian American history, and it stuck with them, and it sticks with us, as you can see. It's on a lot of the icons that we have. So that's some of the details of his life. Again, I've skipped a lot of little things that we know about him, but eventually he did come to the end of his life in 1837. He thought he was going to die at one point. He had kind of the people that were with him on Spruce Island came around, including his adopted son Gerasim, his disciple Gerasim, and St. Herman was dying and reading him the book of Acts, reading him scripture, and all of a sudden St. Herman kind of revives. He says, you know what? I'm paraphrasing. The Lord has given me another week. And so he had another week, and then he took sick again, and then we have the scene where he does in fact repose at this point. He's gathered his people around him again. The scriptures are being read, and eventually on November 15th, he does repose in the Lord. And it is said at Fognac Island, if we look at my map again, let's look at the Spruce Island map. We have Kodiak Island, big island down here, Kodiak settlements, Spruce Island, a Fognac Island. And there were some natives up on Fognac Island, and a lot of them saw this pillar of light streaming above Spruce Island. They knew immediately that this was the repose of St. Herman. One evening above the village Katani on a Fognac, an unusual pillar of light which reached up to heaven was seen above Spruce Island. Astonished by this, a couple of the folks said, it seems that Father Herman has left us, and they began to pray. And after that time, they were informed, indeed, that the elder had indeed passed away that very night. The same pillar was seen in various places by many others. On the night of his death, a vision was seen in another settlement of the same Fognac Island. And he saw a man rising up into the heavens. That was a sign that Father Herman had passed. He passed away in November, and word got back to Kodiak, and the governor there said, well, we're going to put together that coffin and send it over there. Father Herman had left instructions to not tell the people in Kodiak. He kind of wanted to be left alone and buried by the folks on Spruce Island in a very unassuming way. And so they tried to send this coffin in, and they had to come across that 1.25 mile strait, and there was a storm. The storm arose out of the blue and prevented them from crossing that strait. And this storm went on for a month, literally a month. And then finally, the folks on Spruce Island, Father Herman was laying there in his cell, incorrupt. In fact, there was a sweet smell, according to Gerasim, his adopted son, when he reposed. But he was not corrupt for a month. And he was buried the way he wanted to be buried. He was buried by his people in the earth with his, what he called his blanket, his wooden board that he used as a blanket over top of him. And so that's why we have all these days that we celebrate St. Herman. November 15th-ish is the day of his repose. December 13th is the day that he was buried. And then we have the glorification of St. Herman, which is coming up on August 9th. And so, getting into the glorification, we have proof of the intercession of St. Herman. These are just two examples that we find on a lot of these life icons. We have St. Innocent, right? So Christianity had several generations in Alaska. You had the kind of loose Christianity before there was any mission from Valom. You had sort of the first generation of monks that came with St. Herman. And then you had St. Innocent in the 1840s and 50s that kind of came in and really solidified the Christianity that was there and did a lot of extremely important work and really nailed down the foundation that the monks from Valom set. So St. Innocent, in traveling around in the year 1842, St. Innocent had been consecrated the bishop of the area, and his ship, which was sailing from Russia to Alaska, came into a storm, and he began to pray and call upon St. Herman. This is in 1842, just 5 years after St. Herman had reposed. And so immediately the storm ceased. So that story is recorded, and it's part of why that's part of the miracles that we attribute to St. Herman. There's also this little scene of 1907, there was a woman with a serious leg ailment who prayed at St. Herman's grave, and she was cured of her ailment through his intercession, and that is recorded for us on the icon as well. There's a lot of history and detail, but basically in 1970, St. Herman was canonized. That's an actual photograph from the canonization. You see his coffin there. You see the iconic representation of the same, essentially. St. Herman was canonized on August 9th, 1970. The Church of the Holy Resurrection, the picture I showed you earlier in Kodiak, Alaska. His relics are still there. In case Michael was watching, what does that mean? This is a let me explain this. My godfather is a man named Michael. He's very consistently, for many years, has pointed out to me that we have in this icon of the life of St. Herman, you have perhaps the only iconic representation of a helicopter. This is very, very important, right? It is in a sense, because we talk about the legacy of St. Herman. So St. Herman, as we sang tonight, was the first saint in North America. Was he the first? He's the first one that we've elevated him to that status. We call him the first saint of North America. And yet, even to this day, in this modern world, he's still an important saint to us, maybe more so than ever. And so I think that helicopter is important. Our faith is an ongoing faith. It's not just past history. Today, it's now, the 70s, but it's still, we have the ongoing faith, and we do have that helicopter in there, and that's important. In the prayer that we read, that Father read when we were in bended knees, there's also this portion, and this is kind of the legacy, I think, the legacy of St. Herman. That prayer says, "Come to the aid of our spiritual leaders, that they may always be true and effective instruments of the Holy Spirit, with the power to proclaim the evangelical truths, with the wisdom wisdom to enlighten the unenlightened, with the Spirit to inspire all to love the knowledge of God, with the perseverance to defend the church, even unto death, from all enemies, both within and without, at all times. We need intercessors like Father Herman, like Saint Herman. We call upon him. We should also emulate his faith. You know, his beautiful faith in the Mother of God. That just strikes me every time I think about the connection points in his life. When he was sick as a child at age 12, when he was at Milan, living as a hermit, a semi-hermit, when he did go to church on the feast days, people would see tears streaming as he repeated, "Most Holy Theotokos, save us." You know, he really had a devotion to Our Lady, trusting in her to stop that flood. Right? That's the faith that we want to emulate. That's the faith that continues even to the present day with its modern marvels, such as helicopters, which appear in icons as well. So, Michael, if you're watching on YouTube, there you have it. That's part of the legacy of St. Herman. It was to bring his body from Spruce Island to Kodiak. I should mention that, yeah. Why is there a helicopter? So that's the meaning of that little vignette there, the bringing of the coffin. Yeah. All right, I've talked an awful lot. I've skipped probably all the miracles you wanted to hear about and stories you wanted to hear, but thoughts, questions, comments. St. Herman of Alaska.
What happened between, you said he was in, I think, Milan for 5 years, so till he was 17. And then it wasn't until he was 42 that he was in the other monastery. Which I
Right.
forget. So what happened in between?
Well, no, the first monastery was St. Sergius.
St. Sergius. Okay, so he's there for 5 years.
He's there for a couple of years, yes, at least 5 years, I think. Then he came to Milan young, and then left at 42-ish, 40-ish.
Oh, okay. So I had that mixed up.
Imagine that. Imagine walking a quarter way around the world in your 40s. And it's winter. And you're on a dog sled or horseback, and there's bears trying to kill you, and, or ships trying to drown you. Amazing. He was a very hard guy. He was a very hard man. He very strong. In the end of his life, though, he did basically lose his vision to some extent, quite a bit. But he had a very healthy life. He didn't lose his spiritual vision. Yeah.
Are there any stories of him having any special relationships with animals living?
Oh, yes. So the one icon where I should say that St. Herman's life was at the same time, basically, the same time frame as St. Seraphim of Sarov. St. Seraphim of Sarov is, of course, famous for his relationship with the bear, right? And St. Herman is known for this icon's blurry, but you can't really see there's animals. Not only is he talking to angels, but he had a relationship with the birds and the creatures of Spruce Island as well. Very, very, they got to trust him. There was a story of some kind of crazy marmot or something, some kind of furry animal that was really unfriendly, but he had a really good relationship with it. It was almost, I wouldn't say a pet, but most of the saints are very. That's why I know I'm not a saint, right? I'm not a cat person. I know I'm a cat. My wife will tell you until I overcome that.
I told you to say
I feel guilty, when I look at saints like Saint Herman or Saint Paisios or Saint Seraphim of Sarov, they just have a natural. What is sanctity? What is sainthood? It is being restored to what the created order should have been, right? And in the beginning, we lived in harmony with everything. And there was no fear of the animals, of human beings. And so that is a sign of saintliness. And when we see men like St. Herman and so on, they have that relationship with animals where they just trust. There's a relationship, and we know that they are truly saints. And I am truly not.
I just wanted to make a comment on one of the interesting lines I think from St. Herman's life. First of all, actually, I want to make 3 comments. The first one is, that for those of you who know St. Justin Martyr and this idea of the seed of the word, that there are elements of the truth about God that are scattered all throughout the world, and these things can be fanned into flame, and when they come into flame, they'll be Christianity. This whole missionary journey, I think one of the very startling things to me, these are not, modern woke people or anything like that, but they go expecting, they actually quote St. Justin Martyr in some of their letters on that very issue, that God is already active among the native peoples before they get there. And one of the things that I'm afraid I think you left out that I think is very important is that these men, and especially St. Herman, were committed to teaching these people in their own languages, right? They committed to learn the language. And so you can say, well, how do I know I'm not a saint? I lived for a year in a native area of Alaska and didn't even try. So, from the animals, I know from but I didn't even try. But there was a desire to teach in their own language, and that's something, by the way, that's going to be through the entire Russian period. Saint Innocent is going to take up that legacy, and they're going to be translating the liturgy into the native languages. They're going to be translating the Gospels into the native languages, and so on, and other parts of the Scripture as well. They're going to set up schools, ultimately, that teach people in the native languages. And this is something, unfortunately, that gets stamped out by the United States after the Alaska Purchase. I mean, we very violently and oppressively stamped that stuff out. And there was a definite intention on the part of our federal government to destroy the native languages, actually. It was a stated intention. I mean, it's not like something.
No, it wasn't secret. Yeah. That was done with a lot of our dealings with the Native Americans. We're going to turn you into Europeans like us, and we're going to stamp out the language, and if not, well, then you're going to.
That was my third point there. I got lost there. Actually, that maybe applies to some of these guys there too as well. But I don't know if it was St. Herman or if it was another member of the expedition, but when they arrived on Kodiak, they were so aghast at the concubinage, at the slavery, at the absolute lack of care for other people's lives and this kind of thing. I don't know if it was Herman that said it or one of his companions, but they said, "My goodness, the pagans are more Christian than the Christians," and that was their take on the Russian American corporation guys. Well, okay, I got a fourth point here. Like St. Herman, so you talked about the monk priest going back to basically tell on.
Yes.
St. Herman also, continued to send letters back saying like things are not getting better. They're not getting better. These people are monsters. You need to help. And so this is the kind of thing that gets him, death threats and imprisonment on Kodiak as well. So, I mean, he's a really heroic figure. And kind of staggering, too, in the sense of, like, you never would have expected when that group of, I don't know how many of them were there, 12 or something like that, thereabouts, 10?
Just 10.
Yeah. And, like, why is this guy? I mean, and this is the choice of God, right? Like, why is this guy the spiritual leader of American Orthodoxy? Like, he's not even a priest.
No.
No.
He never wanted to maintain that simplicity of a monastic. You're right. That's the thing. He was never a priest. I always pondered that when I was younger in the faith. But he wanted to maintain that simplicity of life. If you look at that list, he was just above the novices. He wasn't a higher monk or higher deacon or anything like that. He was just a simple monk. But he had that intensity of prayer and trust and faith that I think is rare. It, you know, I think it comes back to his devotion to Our Lady. To be honest with you.
Maybe you could smell like a great severity towards himself, but a great generosity towards others. I think in one of the icons you had on there, most people did not know it during his life. He carried a very heavy physical cross under his clothing. Yeah, go ahead.
You can see it.
Does that still exist, the cross?
Yes, it's in Kodiak. It's in Holy Resurrection Cathedral. Where's the one I'm thinking of there? Okay, that's the one. Yeah, so that's it there. A lot of the icons you'll see, he has this large iron cross, not iron cross from World War II, but that is an iron cross and heavy chains. There's a 16-pound iron there, 16 pounds, and he wore that. He didn't wear it openly like you see in the icon. He wore underneath his garb so that people wouldn't see it. He was very careful to cover the fact that he had a heavy iron cross. He was actually trying to be very careful to cover the fact that he slept using bricks as his pillow. He really wanted to maintain an asceticism, but he didn't want anybody. He didn't want to brag about it. He didn't want anybody to know about it necessarily. But he took those feats as simply and as quietly as he could, which speaks to his character, I believe, as well. I guess it's a thing now. Weight training. Joey. It was in the I'm serious. Like that guy that got sucked in the MRI the other day. It was in the news. It was because he was wearing kind of weight training necklace. It was a big heavy weight. He got sucked in the MRI, and that was the end of it.
Is he alive?
No.
Oh,
No.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Well,
I've heard like weight vests. I've never heard of like weight necklaces or anything like that.
yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts, questions?
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. And again, thank you for your service to our parish during these last months.
Thank you.